Tell me anything, tell me everything, revoke our time apart, love me fierce in danger. Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book that was highly influential to James Ellroy, a book that he admired, loved, that amused him, that moved him, that thrilled him. And the book for this week's episode is The Fixer by Bernard Malamud. So to give you some background, Bernard Malamud was born in 1914 in Brooklyn. He's a lifelong New Yorker, and he was born to Russian Jewish immigrants who ran and owned grocery stores. And from an early age, he developed an interest in the nature of human existence and human struggle. It was something that he developed from his own experiences. His mother attempted suicide by drinking detergent. She was saved, but she spent the rest of her life in a mental institution. His brother also had mental health problems. And Malamud was actually exempt from service in World War II because he was the carer to his father. He was educated at City College of New York and Columbia University, where he gained his master's, and he began publishing short stories and also working as a teacher, academic. And he wrote 7 novels over the course of his lifetime. His first novel was The Natural, a baseball novel that was famously filmed with Robert Redford. He met success pretty much from a very early age, or at least from the beginning of his literary career. And The Fixer tells the story of Yakov Bok, a Jewish man in the shtetl in Russia who abandons his home after his wife, who is barren or is unable to have children, to use more modern terminology, abandons him for another man. Now, before I go on with the plot, it's actually based on the case of Mendel Beilis, who was a Jewish man at the end of in the tail end of the Tsarist Empire of Russia, who was accused of murdering a child, a small boy, in what was known as a blood libel case, which is the myth, the anti-Semitic myth that Jews have murdered Christian children for their blood. He was put on trial, and the case became a cause célèbre because it was used by the Tsarist regime to justify more pogroms against the Jews. But it also became a case where the intellectuals at the time, like Gorky and many other intellectuals, took up the cause of Mendel Beilis in attempts to prove his innocence. The real killers were actually a gang, and Beilis eventually fought very hard to get his trial. The trial took 2 years before he ever came to trial, in which he was imprisoned in the most inhumane conditions possible. And he was acquitted at trial, and he became quite famous. The case was known as the Russian version of the Dreyfus case. He resettled in Palestine, which was then an outpost of the Ottoman Empire, but he struggled to make a living there, and he settled in America, in New York State. Now, The Fixer tells the story fairly loyally to begin with, because Yakov Bok, who is the Mendel Beilis, essentially, very closely modelled on him, he moves to Kiev, and he's not supposed to be living there because Jews aren't allowed to live in certain areas of the city. And he saves the life of a man who has fallen down drunk and is lying face down in the snow. And he manages to revive him and get him home with the help of the man's daughters. It turns out the man is a member of the Black Hundreds, which was an anti-Semitic, ultra-right-wing nationalist reactionary monarchist group in Tsarist Russia. They've actually just been revived in Putin's Russia, which gives you some indication of the nature of the Putin regime. He saves the life of this man, and the man is very grateful and gives him a job running his brick factory business. Of course, the man is unaware that he's Jewish, and it's a good thing too, because the man, being a member of the Black Hundreds, he's a devout anti-Semite, rabidly so. And the man's daughter actually makes a very strong pass at Yakov, who is a very, very passive man. He's hard to kind of either like or dislike at first when you begin the novel, because he served time in the Russian army without distinction. He's got this fairly shambolic marriage, which he's kind of let go to hell, again, very, very passively. And he actually turns down the advances of this woman when he realizes that it's her time of the month, and he's so disgusted by this, he actually kind of flees the scene despite her protestations, saying it's the safest time to do it. There's no worries there. Then, of course, the murder occurs, and he is locked up for it, and he's completely baffled by it because he doesn't even know this child, and he is innocent, but he's locked up, and it's really it follows the case quite closely at first because the blame is actually on the boy's mother, which is kind of close to what really happened in the murder. It was family related. And there is a magistrate called Bibikov who is a little bit ambiguous in his motives, but he takes up Yakov's cause, and he says, "I want to help you, and I want to, help you get your trial, and essentially help you get your acquittal." Or he says, although that might be a long shot, but even in a state as corrupt as the Russian state, justice exists in the cracks. In the artifice of this incredibly authoritarian regime, there will be justice here and there, just because of the nature of any system. Even the illusion of it has to exist, and that's where we're going to pin our hopes. And there's actually a big twist regarding the fate of Bibikov, which I'm, not going to reveal, because the fixer, especially the first 2/3 of it, is an absolutely riveting read. Because I was unaware of the case, and I'd heard of the Dreyfus case, and I was quite intrigued by the parallels between the Mendel Beilis case and the Dreyfus case, and it is really riveting and intriguing and compelling in terms of what's going to happen next. So much so that the novel, which was a huge critical success, it won the National Book Award and it won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and I believe it's one of the very few books that's won both of those awards. But Malamud was accused of plagiarism by Mendel Beilis' family. Mendel Beilis had died suddenly in the late 1950s, so he was gone at this point, which may be one of the reasons that Malamud wrote it. But he'd written a self-published memoir of the case, and by the time of his death, his fame had completely kind of disappeared, but his death led to some kind of revival of interest in the case. But Mendel Beilis' family accused Malamud of plagiarizing this memoir, and a close examination of both the memoir and the novel reveals that many of the lines are actually verbatim. Now, Malamud's biographer, Philip Davis, who, in a little metafictional or just butterfly effect twist of fate, was actually my tutor at the University of Liverpool. Yes, James Ellroy's biographer's tutor was Bernard Malamud's biographer, which I always find very, very interesting. But Philip Davis argues that, yes, many of the sentences are similar, if not identical, but Malamud was to imbue them with a greater philosophical meaning, which is very interesting. But as someone who knows Phil personally, I will say that to Phil Davis, the integrity of the artist is very, very important, and it'd be very important to him to argue against anything that kind of violates that integrity. It's less important to me as a biographer. I'm kind of much more interested in stories outside of the text than Phil was. But anyway, I'm recommending The Fixer as this week's book, so you read the book and maybe track down a copy of the self-published memoir and decide for yourself. But if you're going to be plagiarized in a book that wins the Pulitzer, okay? So it's a kind of a backhanded compliment in that regard. And another little metafictional irony, just while I'm on this tangent, is that Malamud wrote one of the great novels about biography, which was Dubin's Lives. I read it. I deliberately held off on reading it until I was finished writing Love Me, Fierce and Danger. But after Love Me, Fierce and Danger came out, I read Dubin's Life, and I was absolutely stunned by it. It's a great novel about a biographer, a Laurentian biographer, and it's very, very incisive. Malamud draws on a lot of his own life, his own extramarital affairs and things like that this biographer is having. Anyway, to carry on, the fixer for the first 2/3 is this riveting, I say courtroom drama, but obviously the twist is he can't get his trial. It's kind of very Kafkaesque in this way. It is a fantastic novel if you want to think about the pacing of an overall novel, the overall structure, and also the pacing of the individual scenes. And it's very similar in that regard to, say, May 11's Compulsion, another novel that we studied in this case. In that case, it was a non-fiction novel in there that was recreating the Leopold and Loeb murder. And this is another famous Jewish case that Ellroy is very interested in. Scene by scene, detail by detail, and covers the entire case. Malamud isn't really regarded, as far as I know, as a non-fiction novel author. And you can see why, because towards the end you begin to realize we're not going to get to the trial as happened in the Mendel Beilis case. With Yakov Bach, we're going to get kind of stuck in the prison cell. And once you realize that, I feel like the pace kind of slackened a little bit for this reader. And I perhaps would have wanted the story to go elsewhere. But it's still extremely riveting. You know, we're inside Bach's head as he goes through the most inhumane conditions. It's dirty, it's damp, the food is rotten that he has to eat. His body just withers away mentally and physically, but not so much emotionally, because he never gives up. He never gives up for his trial. And at one point they say, because it's one of the Jubilee years for the Romanov dynasty, we're issuing a blanket pardon, you'll be released. And he refuses to accept that because he thinks it's a trick, quite rightly. He thinks it's a trick and he wants his vindication. And, a pardon is in his eyes just an admission of guilt. But it's very, very interesting. And it's actually become part of the culture wars in the United States regarding books that are on school reading lists, because it's been taken off school reading lists a few times by concerned citizen groups, shall we say, regarding the content. And the content is quite strong. Obviously, I say it's a prison novel. It's more of like a gulag novel because the conditions are extremely inhumane today and are brutal to read about, even by United States standards, which has a pretty authoritarian prison regime even today. But the conditions are brutal, and it's strong stuff to read about. I suspect what some of these concerned citizen groups really have against it is the anti-Christian tone of the novel. But by the way, the novel has been named in Supreme Court cases. Apparently, the only Supreme Court case regarding school reading lists. In 1982, I believe that became before the Supreme Court. Because really, in some respects, the Christians are the bad guys, and that's putting in a very, very simplistic viewpoint. But Bach, protesting his innocence, hears all kind of absolutely ludicrous representations of the Jewish faith. The case in the pre-trial hearings, they bring in so-called Jewish experts who have absolutely no real knowledge of the Judaic religion or the Judaic lifestyle, and he's not a practicing Jew. He's a secular Jew, and this is one of the things that the Mendel Beilis family took issue with, because Mendel Beilis was a very religious man, and he's much more of a kind of a vulgar man in many regards. But he hears these things about the Jewish religion, and he's just like, I cannot believe you're saying this about the Jewish people or about me personally. It doesn't make any sense. And he's encouraged to read the Gospels, and at first he resists, because he thinks like, oh, this is just, I don't want to read kind of enemy propaganda. But eventually he relates, and he finds them very, very interesting. He only relents because of the extreme tedium of being locked up 24 hours a day. But he reads them, and he finds them really, really interesting. He's actually moved by the life of Jesus. He reads it right up. He only comments as far as the crucifixion. He doesn't comment afterwards about the resurrection. But he's really moved by Jesus' life. He says he's an odd sort of Jew. He's humorless. He's kind of stiff. He's sexless. but he admires his compassion, and he admires his ministry, I suppose, or more a case of his individual compassion, and he's actually really, really moved by it. And I suspect some of these culture wars are really on a theological level, although it's actually really moving to read about Bach, at least coming round to certain elements of the Gospels, the elements that move him. And the novel becomes very surreal towards the end. There's dream sequences with him having conversations with the Tsar, Nicholas II. Now, we know the Tsar himself is going to meet a wretched end, execution. And in a way that is not that dissimilar, in that he's never given a real trial. I mean, even some of the Bourbon kings who were executed in France, were given a proper trial. So the Tsar is denied that, and the Tsar was made well aware of the Mendel Beilis case. And again, it's like I said, it went all the way to the Tsar, and it was used in the anti-Semitic pogroms. So, broadly speaking, I'm greatly admire this novel, The Fixer by Bernard Malamud. It is an absolutely riveting, very, very powerful read. I'd recommend you probably also read some nonfiction accounts of the case, just to clear the two in your head between Mendel Beilis and Jakob Bach. But this is an absolutely fantastic novel. It's a really important novel in the development of American Jewish literature. It was a big inspiration to James Ellroy. And just to end up to say, this is the last Ellroy Reads of 2024, but I'll be back with more novels in 2025. So I want to say a big thank you to everybody who's watched the show, who's put up with my little plugs for Love Me, Fierce and Danger. I do hope you probably maybe purchase the book after watching these episodes. And I hope you'll join me again in 2025 and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Okay, happy holidays everyone, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.